ሰላም ጤና ይስጥልኝ እንዴት ናችሁ? I hope you are all doing very well. የፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ፖድካስታችንን ዛሬ ደግሞ ጥርምጥን ባለ መልኩ ስለ ፕሮሰስስ ኤንድ ዶሜንስ እንወያያለን። Already introduction to project management, we have discussed about it. We have also covered project management framework እና በተለያየ መልኩ ፍሬምወርክን ከቨር አድርገናል. We even saw why framework is very important. So just to touch a bit, ለምንድነው framework important የሆነው? If you have the liberty to design the project from the very beginning, or if you are joining a project which is already formed, አውቀን እንድንገባበት ፍሬምወርክ ይጠቅመናል ማለት ነው። ባጭሩ ግን ከዛ በላይ ብዙ ኤሪያዎችን ነካክተናል. We will get back to them because framework throughout project management ስለሚከተለን ማለት ነው። ዛሬ ደግሞ we will be discussing processes and domains in project management. We will have a very few sessions today and we'll continue. So the very first thing, processes and domains ስናስብ, we need to clarify what project life cycle is and what project management process is. So project life cycle ብለን የምንለው, this is what we need to do the work. Meaning ይህንን ስራ ለመስራት የምንከተለው ሂደት ላይፍ ሳይክል ብለን እንጠራዋለን. Specific to any project ነው ማለት ነው. As you know, in PMP we say this is industry neutral. የግድ አንድ አይነት ኢንዱስትሪ ላይ ያለ ነው ማለት አይቻልም ወይም አይደለም. So project management እንግዲህ ሙያ ነው. So የፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንትን ሙያ ተከትለን we can run construction or agriculture or IT or social projects, different types of projects. ስለዚህ ግን ሙያ ስፔሲፊክ የሆነው አካሄድ ላይፍ ሳይክሉ ነው ማለት ነው። ፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ስፔሲፊክ የሆነው ደግሞ ፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕስ ብለን የምንጠራቸው ናቸው. Therefore we say this is what you need to do to manage the project. የፕሮጀክት ላይፍ ሳይክሉ this is what you need to do the project. የፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ፕሮሰሱ ግን this is what you need to manage the project. ስለዚህ if you pick a predictive approach, of course, ገና አሁን in the upcoming session we will be discussing about predictive, adaptive and hybrid even in more detail. And if you decide to pick a predictive project management plan, ያው የፕሮጀክት ላይፍ ሳይክል እና ፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕስ አሉ. The very common process groups, what we are referring here, are 5 of them. And now we call them initiating. That's number 1 is initiating. And number 2 is planning. Number 3 is executing. Number 4 is monitoring and controlling. And number 5 is closing. So your project management process groups are these ones. So all projects have a project management process, but each project will have its own specific project life cycle. So from where do you pick the project life cycle? It depends. It's up to you probably. ወይም ደግሞ whoever gave you the project is dictating that you need to follow this, or the type of projects that you are managing will require a certain project life cycle. So a project life cycle, we say, is the performing organizations or departments methodology for managing a project. So over here, logical breakdown of work አለ ማለት ነው, so that the project can have a deliverable. And you know what are the 3 either or deliverables every project has? These are product, service, result ብለን የምንላቸው ናቸው ማለት ነው. This is the logical breakdown of what you need to do to produce or to have the output. And this output can be a product, service or result. So the project life cycle for a particular project is selected based on many factors. So you are in a leadership position here. You may dictate these factors. Or whoever gave you this project, ለምሳሌ it could be your project sponsor, or maybe you get this project through a tender. ስለዚህ በነዛው ሁሉ it can be dictated, of course, but you can decide based on many factors. So this could be the product that you're going to have at the end of the project, or the industry that you follow, or even your organization's preference on certain aspect ማለት ነው. So that's it. That's the way you select the project life cycle. Within a project life cycle, there could be different phases. Yeah. So these phases has to be followed depending on the life cycle that you chose. Life cycle can be plan driven. Life cycle can be change driven. Life cycle can be hybrid. So mind you guys, some of the things are called in many different names, and it could be confusing at first. But when you get the hang of it, nagaryo kalal. I prefer to call them predictive and adaptive. So predictive, as the name suggests, when you know the nitty-gritties of the project, when you know probably the entire detail, እንዴት ብሎ እንደሚጀምር, what are the inputs, መሀል ላይ ያሉት activities, list of activities, and how it gets concluded. ሙሉ ዲቴይሉ አንደርስታንድ አድርገነው አንዳንዴም በድግግሞሽ ካወቅነው maybe the length of the project is so small also አንዳንዴ ስቴፑም ለመረዳት የምንችልበት ከሆነ you can predict መተንበይ ይቻላል ማለት ነው. therefore የፕሪዲክቲቭ ፕላኒንግ አፕሮችን እንጠቀማለን. So the predictive one is also called plan driven. ሌላኛው ስሙ plan driven. The predictive one is also known as waterfall approach or traditional planning approach ተብለው ይጠራሉ ማለት ነው. So if you listen these many varieties of names, we are basically referring to the predictive life cycle. The second one is the adaptive life cycle. The adaptive life cycle is when you don't know much about the project, when you don't have all the nitty-gritties. Sometimes you have even not a clear understanding of the inputs, or eventually step by step ስትሄዱበት ቦታው ላይ ስትደርሱ የምትረዱትና adjust adapt ያደረግን የምንሄድ ከሆነ we call this adaptive life cycle. So the adaptive life cycle is also known as predictive, and currently we also call it agile. So agile የሚለውን ቃል ስትሰሙ you may think it's a whole different philosophy. Yes, it's actually a philosophy by itself, ግን it belongs to a project life cycle ማለት ነው. And the third one is called hybrid. So the hybrid, as the name suggests, is a combination of both of them. This is the predictive and the adaptive project life cycle. So the plan-driven projects have predictive development approach. Sometimes you call them waterfall, sometimes you call them ባህላዊ እንደምንለው traditional life cycle, and they require the scope, the schedule, and the cost to be fully determined at the start or at the early phase of your project. And you clearly know how it begins. You clearly know what are the list of activities to be done in the middle. And you clearly know how the end result is going to be, either the product, service, or result. So, በዛ መልኩ እንሄዳለን ማለት ነው. But, sometimes this is great. But some of the time, depending on the nature of your industry, it's just impractical. You don't know everything in detail. Therefore, you may not want to follow this life cycle. It's really regimented. Changes are not accepted easily. If a change comes, they have a very strict change management procedure. ምናልፋችሁ ሰጥ ለጥ ያለ አገዛዝ ያለበት የፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ስታይል ነው ማለት ነው. Some of the industries like construction projects would typically benefit from a predictive life cycle, obviously if the planning is really done very well ማለት ነው. So you also have to note that a project may use a combination of incremental and iterative life cycle throughout the project or phase. ስለዚህ you may divide it into different phases, and ለምታውቋት phase plan driven ተጠቅመን as the project progresses, and when you're getting close to the next phase, more details are becoming clear and obvious. Based on that እየጨመርንበት እንሄዳለን ማለት ነው. አሁንም we can follow the predictive life cycle. Otherwise, if we combine it, it will be the hybrid one. The other one is the adaptive. The adaptive, previously on version 6 and all, we used to call it change driven. The name agile was not that popular back then. Now it's የጊዜው term ነው. Yeah. So change driven projects, they use iterative, incremental, or adaptive, which we call agile development life cycle. And እዚህ ጋር እንግዲህ እቅድ በምናቅድበት ጊዜ they have really varying levels of early planning for scope, schedule and cost. On the predictive, we say ድርቅ ብሎ የተጻፈ ቅንጭጭ ንጹህ in black and white የተዘረዘረ ስኮፕ ስኬጁል እና ኮስት ይዘን ነው የምንጀምረው። ይሄኛው ግን when you know more refine እያደረግነው የምንሄድበት አይነት አካሄድ ያለው ነው። So incremental and iterative life cycles involve early planning of high-level scopes. These are sufficient to allow preliminary estimates for time and cost is determined a little more as the project progresses with further iteration ማለት ነው። With an iterative development life cycle like this one, the complete concept is built in successive levels of details, and then you create the end result. So adaptive development life cycle involves a fixed schedule as well as fixed costs. Yeah? You know what I want to say. Adaptive development life cycle ሲጀምር ፕሮጀክቱ የሚፈጀውን ጊዜ ፊክስ አድርጎ ነው የሚጀምረው። ሲጀምር መስራት የሚፈልገውን ስኮፕ ኤንድ ሪኳየርመንት ፊክስ አድርጎ ነው የሚጀምረው። እንደገናም ኮስቱንም ቢሆን በጀቱንም ይሄን ያክል ብቻ ነው ስፔንድ ማድረገው ብሎ ወስኖ ነው የሚጀምረው። In the predictive development life cycle ሲጀምር fixed schedule, fixed scope እና fixed cost ይዞ ነው የሚጀምረው። But the adaptive development life cycle again is not that fixed. It has a varying range. በዛ ውስጥ ጀምረን እንሄዳለን። Scope is broadly defined with the understanding that it will be refined throughout the life of the project. አሁን ይሄንን ለመረዳት ብዙ ሰው የሚቸገርበት ኤሪያ አለ። ግን ኢንዱስትሪው ስፔሲፊክ አርገን በምንወያይበት ጊዜ it's kind of clear. ለምሳሌ ዌብሳይት ዴቨሎፕ የሚያደርጉ ሰዎች የሆነ የሶፍትዌር ሲስተም ዴቨሎፕ የሚያደርጉ ለምሳሌ ERP ሲስተም ዴቨሎፕ አድርገው ወርክ ፍሎ ኦፕቲማይዜሽን የሚሰሩ ሰዎች there are many CI ብለን የምንጠራቸው ወይም ኮንፊጉሬሽን አይተምስ ብለን የምንጠራቸው ኬዞች አሉ። ሶ እነሱ ከሰሩ በኋላ ሐሳባቸውን ቢለውጡ the cost of redoing it, reworking it and everything is much less as compared to a predictive environment. ለምሳሌ አንድ የድልድይ የሚሰራ ፕሮጀክት ድልድዩን የተሳሳተ ቦታ ላይ ቢሰራው ወይንም መነሻውን ሲጀምር ኮኦርዲኔቶች ቢያበላሽ መዳረሻው obviously የሆነ ዞር ብሎ ወይንም የማይታሰብበት ቦታ ላይ ኮኔክት አድርጎ ሊቀመጥ ይችላል ማለት ነው። ይሄ ተሳስተናልና we need to break it down and we need to build a new one ብንል can you imagine ምን ያህል ኮስት እንዳለው even to demolish it በራሱ ፕሮጀክት ነው የሚሆነው። ከዛ ደግሞ from where are you getting all the funds to build a second bridge for the correct coordinate ማለት ነው። so for that one እንደፈለጉ መለዋወጥ በማይቻልበት ሁኔታ መጀመሪያውኑ clearly ስኮፑ ክሊር ሆኖ 2 3 4 ጊዜ ለክተን ሹር ሆነን ከዛ በኋላ የሚፈጀውንም ጊዜና ገንዘብ ይዘን እንጀምራለን፣ ስራውን እንሰራለን and hopefully we connect it at both ends at the correct place. ግን ይሄ ነገር ሶፍትዌር ቢሆን የሆነ ግራፊካሊ ቢሆን እየሰራን ያለነው ግራፊካል ዲዛይን ቢሆን ለምሳሌ እየሰራን ያለነው ከዛ በኋላ ሲሙሌት ስናደርገው you figure out something is wrong ሄዶ ኮኔክት የሚያደርግበት ቦታ a little bit ዞር ያለ ይሆናል but this is fine now. You basically need to change a few coordinates እና ዞር አድርገን ኮኔክት እናደርገዋለን. We might even delete it and rebuild it again. So the cost of rebuilding it is much less. Therefore, on some sectors, change driven is accepted. የሚያመጣው ኢምፓክት ትንሽ ከመሆኑ የተነሳ ወይንም ደግሞ the very many choices that we have ክፍት ቢሆኑልን እንጠቀማለን ተብሎ ስለሚታሰብ agility ይዘን እንሄዳለን። ቀልጣፋነት ነው most agility. So this is where their difference is. ግን it doesn't mean a project has to begin with the same life cycle and get done all the way till the end with the same one. Because some of the works sensitivityያቸው የግድ የፕሪዲክቲቭ ኔቸርን ይፈልጋል። some of the things that we follow ግን ሴንሲቲቪቲያቸው አዳፕቲቭን ቢከተሉ ይጠቅማል ብለን ካሰብን you can divide your project into 2, 4, 5, 6 you name it ምን ያህል ፌዝ እንደሚያስፈልጋችሁ different phases. During these phases now some of the phases can be adaptive and some of the phases can be predictive ማለት ነው. So for the phase that you know the nitty-gritties you can use a predictive approach. For the phase that you do not have full information, you can go for an adaptive. And while the project is going through phase 1, let's say in this case we picked predictive, more information is flowing to you and you're having more ideas about the next phase. So based on the detailed information that you have at hand, you can design the plan for the second phase. You adapt based on the situation ማለት ነው. This phenomenon is what we call the hybrid life cycle. ስለዚህ hybrid life cycle እንግዲህ ቅይጥ ነው የፕሪዲክቲቭ እና የአዳፕቲቭ ዴቨሎፕመንት ላይፍ ሳይክል ነው ማለት ነው. So በዚህ ዘዴ a predictive life cycle is used to manage the project requirements that are really well defined. ሁሉ ነገሩን ለምናውቀው. While for your adaptive life cycle is used to manage the requirements that are less clear. Yeah? So, ይህንን hybrid ዘዴ ተከትለን እንሄዳለን ማለት ነው. So, I think that is clear. Yeah? I hope that's clear. On the upcoming sessions, መሃል ላይ እዚህ ላይ discussion እያደረግን እንሄዳለን. So, today we are covering processes and domains of project management. And as we began, we talked about two nice and important concepts. These are the project life cycle and the project management process groups. The project life cycle ምንድነው እንግዲህ ስራውን ለመስራት የሚያስፈልገን ዘዴ ነው። ለእሱ የፕላኒንጋችንን ዲተርማይን ያደርገዋል ዴቨሎፕመንት አፕሮቻችንን and we have predictive, adaptive or hybrid ማለት ነው. In the project management process group, if we select the predictive approach, we will be using the 5 process groups. These are the initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling and closing ብለን እንጠራቸዋለን ማለት ነው. So let's talk about the project management process groups. As the name suggests, 5 of them are very important. And it gives you a very nice and clear mental map. But the thing is, most people think things are happening sequentially. No, things are not happening sequentially here. What is the initiating process group? I'll be discussing each one of them in detail. They will have a podcast exclusively for each of them. But just to give you, a sneak preview, initiating is all about converting ideas which are on different teammates' head, ideas that are floating all over the place, to document them and to come up with an agreed direction. And when you capture it, you call that output a project charter. The project charter is the main deliverable of the initiating process group. The project charter charts the way. It shows you the direction of the project. The second one is the planning process group. The planning process group እቅድ ማቀድ ነው. And this happens sequentially. You're done with initiating, therefore you'll be coming to the planning process group. In the initiating process group, you're probably alone. But in the planning process group, the main PMism is that you should not be alone. Remember, you are a generalist, and your job is to gather a group of specialists. These are subject matter experts. እነሱ ናቸው እቅዱን ማቀድ ያለባቸው ሙሉ ዲቴይል እቅዱን. In this exercise, your job is to be a facilitator, a coordinator, a moderator. የማሳለጥ ስራ ነው የምትሰሩት ማለት ነው. Once you are done with the planning process group, we'll be going to the executing process group. ስለዚህ እቅድ ስላለቀ ወደ ትግበራ ገባን ማለት ነው. ትግበራው ላይ በምንገባበት ጊዜ መስራት ነው. ምን እቅድ ላይ ያዝ ነው. So over here, some of the things that you have foreseen in your mind, what you document in your project management plan, may not allow your teammates to do a very good project execution. So in such a case, you may return back to the planning board. ስለዚህ you see here, it's not really sequential. ወደ ኋላም ያስገደናል. If some things are not clear, if some things are not planned well, if some things are not, detailed well. So ዛጋ ለአቃጆቹ ተሰጥቶ whatever correction or ማብራሪያ ተሰጥቶበት ተመልሰን ወደ ትግበራ እንገባለን። ትግበራ ላይ ኤክሲኪዩቲንግ ከጨረስን በኋላ we move ahead to monitoring and controlling. እንግዲህ the confusing part, I'll speak really more in detail about this, especially executing, monitoring and controlling እናስመልክቶ. In my experience or observation, what I've noticed is most people think after you're done with executing, you will begin with monitoring and controlling. But that's not the case. Let me give you an example. Let's get out of project management for a little bit. Let's say መኪና እየነዳችሁ and you've decided to reach to a certain destination driving. So you have your project charter ማለት ነው. It tells you have to use this route and you have to reach at certain place at a certain time. Therefore, በዛ ቻርተር መሰረት you started planning. Further planning meaning የትኛውን መንገድ ብጠቀም or something like that የሚሉትን ነገሮች እዛው ሩት ውስጥ ያሉትን አማራጮች አይተን እንሄዳለን። ስለዚህ መኪና መንዳቱም ተመርጧል፣ እየነዳን ነው ብለን እናስብ። So ስንነዳ we call it executing in this example. But while we are driving, we need to monitor the car. ስለዚህ based on your monitoring, you get a work performance data. This is raw data. On your dashboard, you see the speed. Over there next to it, maybe you have a clock, so you see the time. You see different parameters about the health of your car. በመስተዋቱ ውጭ ደግሞ ስትመለከቱ you have more data, pedestrians moving around, ምናምን fast moving objects, እንቅፋት የሆኑ ሰዎች ምናምን, all those things monitor እያደረግን ነው የምንነዳው. Based on that monitoring, you get a work performance data. You process it in your mind, and that becomes a work performance information. Based on that work performance information, you make a decision. The decision could be speed up. You're too late. So when you're speeding up your car, what you're doing is basically controlling the situation. Or the decision could be, reduce your speed or even stop. Or even change a little bit direction and get on track again. That activity is what we call controlling. So controlling cannot happen if you don't have a good data from monitoring. And there is nothing to monitor unless there is some form of execution, some form of a work. So executing, monitoring and controlling in reality, actually they go hand in hand. This is not something that you do first as executing, you're done, and then monitoring and controlling የምናደርገው situation አይደለም. But in project management standard, they have been classified and divided like this for the sake of our understanding. So monitoring and controlling በዚህ መልኩ ተረዱት. So it could be done side by side, it should be done side by side with executing most of the things. But there are obviously some ceremonious monitoring and controlling activities. Maybe you have an external auditor coming and checking your work. Maybe you have people from the project sponsor, project acceptors. እነሱ ደግሞ መጥተው they may have also a look and then accept or reject your work. So whenever something is monitored, whenever something is audited, we do have a result. And this result could be conformity, which is it confirms with what we planned. This result could be non-conformance, which is what we planned and what is done does not match. Or you could even find preventive maintenance. Things have not yet gone wrong, but you see all the symptoms. All the signs are out there, so you need to take care. So that could lead you back to the planning board. That could even lead you back to your project sponsors. And you could say, hey, madam or Mr. Sponsor, what you have in mind and the reality do not match. You might want to give us a new charter, or you might even want to stop the project altogether. So, but if everything goes well, we go to the closing process group. Therefore, the initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and last but not least, closing process groups do not go one after the other. They intermingle with each other actually. So please have an understanding of this process in such a way. So if you have a small project, you can go for a predictive approach, and of course it should have its own life cycle, and within that small project you follow that predefined life cycle. But if you have a large project, you need to divide it into different phases, and when you phase it, you need to have phase gates. So when phase 1 is completed and it reaches closing, before you move to phase 2 and begin with initiating, you need to have a phase gate. So the output of phase 1 is going to be the input of phase 2. So phase gates are very, very important. And guys, I really tell you, please don't handle your project without breaking it into different phases. It's not easy to manage it. It has to be divided, sliced, diced, dissected into different meaningful phases. እና በዛ መሰረት ከፋፍለን ብንይዘው it would be great ማለት ነው። Wonderful. We are done with this one. Let's begin with the first process group, which we call initiating. The initiating process group. You know, from the 5 process group, 2 of them are highly neglected. Sometimes people are not even aware that they exist. What are they? The first one, initiating, is neglected a lot. And the last one, closing, also have the same predicament. Let's think, what are the things that you need to consider when you are initiating a project? So we said everything in the world is an idea. ዓለም ላይ ያለው ነገር በሙሉ በመጀመሪያ ሐሳብ ነበር። ሐሳብ ሆኖ እንዳይቀር ሰዎች ካሰቡት በኋላ ያወሩታል፣ ያወሩትን ይጽፉታል፣ የጻፉትን እንደ ፕሮጀክት ፕሮፖዛል ያቀርቡታል ብለን እናስብ። And on one of our podcasts we talked about project proposal, and that unless you have different proposals, and unless you have these proposals competing amongst each other, unless you have a business process to select the best project at hand, don't jump into the project. This could be a pet project. So you want to have a project which is meaningful, which has a direct relationship with the mission of the company, which has an alignment with the vision, with the corporate strategy. This is why project selection is really very important. After a project is selected, and now then the first PMism is to have a project manager selected, and a project manager is appointed. And if you are selected as the project manager, and if you are on the initiating process group, what should you do? First and foremost, you need to determine the company culture and existing systems. ስለዚህ just like a doctor, what does a doctor do first? A doctor first diagnoses, then a doctor prescribes. A doctor does not prescribe before a proper diagnosis of the situation. So a good project manager has good interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills are very, very important, and we saw them during our project framework area. So these interpersonal skills could be your observation skills, your conversation skills. This interpersonal skill is your influencing skill, your facilitation skill. This interpersonal skill is your awareness of the situation, of your cultural awareness. It's about your emotional intelligence. It's about how you negotiate with people. You can't negotiate with anyone unless you understand their stance. It's about your political awareness of the project environment. It's the way you manage your meetings. It's your observation of the current team and how you would like to form the upcoming team, how you will handle the recruitment. It's about your conflict management skills. It's all about your influencing and leadership skills. ስለዚህ, when you take over a project, your job is to observe the situation, to have an understanding of the cultural aspect of that company, to have an understanding of what are the existing systems running in that company. And we call this in a gross format the enterprise environmental factor. It is also known as the enterprise environmental factor. And next, you need to collect the processes, procedures, and historical information. How is work done in this office? What are the work flows? What are the business processes? Do you have access to the standard operating procedure? Do you really understand what is the work instruction for a certain, for example, payment process? All these things has to be gathered, captured, understood beforehand. You will need to have some sort of historical information about the project, or if the company has done similar projects in the past. And then you need to divide that large project into different phases or smaller groups. You know, the untrained project manager manages the project just like that. A common question we ask on our project management trainings is, how do you eat an ox? And mulu bari in one gwand so ibelal ወይ ነው? The answer is yes, to your surprise. The further answer is step by step, bite by bite, not in one go. Therefore, your project also has to be phased. Your project also has to be divided so that it can be easily understood, managed, strategized for. And it's your job to next look at the business case. The business case in project management is, why did they get into this project on the first place? What are they trying to achieve here? Who are the beneficiaries of this project? Understand all this. That makes you a great project manager. And you also need to uncover initial requirements, any assumptions, risks, constraints, and existing agreements before you even move to planning. Imagine, we have not yet started the planning process group. This is the place where we are testing the idea, where we are capturing different variants of the idea, any derivatives which come up from this idea, any stakeholder that's contributing towards this idea, any stakeholder that's going to affect this project negatively. We capture all these cases. So you really have to collect the initial requirements. Requirements are going to be further detailed in the upcoming process groups when you move to the planning process group, and when you are provoking it in the executing process group, when you're going to check it in the monitoring process group, and when you're going to hand it over to your project sponsor, these requirements are going to be revised, and they are going to be seen and checked, and they are going to be, seen from different angles. And you have to also understand what are the assumptions. The assumption that you're making, the assumption that your project sponsor is making, the assumption that any one of your least important and most important stakeholders are making. What are the constraints? What are the limitations of this project with the given information that you have at hand? Which other agreements have your project signed which is going to impact your project? Maybe you even got this project on a tender, you won a tender. What happens next? They give you a contract. The details of the contract should be an input for your initiating process group. And with all that, you assess the project or the product to be feasible. With all these given constraints, you ask yourself, is this going to be successful? Is this going to be possible? You check on all that. And the first person that needs to be satisfied or convinced is you. You need to believe that this is going to be achieved. Unless you trust your intuition and your assessment, do not move forward. And if you find out that this is not feasible, this cannot be accomplished, it is your professional and social responsibility. It is your etiquette as a project manager to notify your project sponsor about your findings. You should not hold your findings behind and move on when you're certain that the project is not feasible. But if you think it's feasible and if you're convinced, you need to convert all these ideas into a measurable project objective. You need to convert it into a success criteria, list of success criteria, and take it to your project sponsor and say, hey, is this that you have in mind? Would you consider me successful if I fulfill this, if I achieve this? And then the project sponsor is going to say, yes, exactly. Or the project sponsor could be saying, no, that's not what I have in mind. If you listen to this quotation, that's not what I have in mind. During the initiating process group, it is good. Had you finished the project and when you are handing it over, and if you listen, that's not what I had in mind, that's going to be one catastrophe. Imagine all your efforts. Imagine your team's effort. Imagine the amount of time and resources and organizational budget that is basically wasted on this project. That's not what I had in mind. Phew, so bad. This is the reason you really have to finish everything on paper first, and this process group that we call initiating is helping you with this real. Therefore, if you get that acceptance, you document it in a project charter and you give it to your project sponsor. It has to be signed, and now you have a project. The project charter charts the way. It indicates the direction you're going to follow. And then organizational resources are going to be committed for this project. The organization, the company is going to be committed to provide these services. One of the most important aspects that you need to consider during the initiating process group, obviously you need to continue with this as well, are the stakeholders. ባለድርሻ አካላት ብለን የምንጠራቸው. You need to identify your stakeholders and what type of resources that you're going to need and determine their expectations. There are 3 I's, I like the capital I, the letter I, in stakeholder management. Number 1 I is interest. Number 2 I is influence. Number 3 I is impact. Interest, influence, impact. We will delve into these ones as our podcast continues in the future episodes, especially when we reach to the stakeholder chapter. But for now, know that you need to identify the stakeholders that are going to be positively impacted by your project. You need to identify your stakeholders that are going to be negatively impacted by your project, and you need to identify what are the resources that are needed for this project. Therefore, you set your expectations right by analyzing the interest, influence, and impact of a project. If the project charter is signed and if you figure out a major, information that will impact the project, don't hesitate to get it updated, because you have not yet moved to the planning process group. And with the dream and worry of a project manager, you need to also have an assumptions log. We covered an assumption log in one of the previous episodes. An assumptions log has 2 things. It has the assumption itself and the constraints. Both of them together, we call it the assumptions log. An assumption is anything that you consider to be true. A guess is when you or one person is making a forecast or an estimation. But when a group or a company or an organization or an association, so to speak, makes a group thinking, makes a group guessing, you call this assumption. So these assumptions has to be logged on your assumptions log. A constraint is anything that you find of a short supply. And all these will lead you to develop and of course update your stakeholders register. Stakeholders has to be registered. Stakeholders expectation, interest, influence and impact has to be analyzed. The stakeholder community keeps growing. It could shrink. It's a very dynamic community that you have from beginning till end. So there you have it. We are done with the initiating process group. The main output of this process group is the project charter. Do not start a project without a project charter. The charter indicates or charts the direction of your project, and it captures all the pertinent information. It gives you the authority to commit organizational resources and move ahead. የፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ፕሮሰስስ ወይም sometimes ፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ሞዴልስ ብለን የምንላቸው አሉ። የዚህ የፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ፕሮሰስ ውስጥ የመጀመሪያው the initiating process group ነው። ሁለተኛው the planning process group ነው። ሶስተኛው the executing process group ነው። አራተኛው the monitoring and controlling process group ነው። አምስተኛው ደግሞ the closing process group ነው ማለት ነው። so initiating normally ፎከስ የሚያደርገው ሐሳብን መሰብሰብ፣ ምክንያቱም ሁሉ ነገር ዓለም ላይ ሐሳብ ነው። ሲጀምር ሐሳብ ነበረ፣ በኋላ ነው ተተግብሮ ሪያሊቲ ሆኖ እውን ሆኖ የምናየው ማለት ነው። so ሐሳብን ሰብስቦ መከተብ፣ እንደገና ደግሞ ብዙ ስቴክሆልደሮች ስላሉ ፕሮጀክት ላይ የተለያየ ሐሳብ ይዘው ሁሉም ባይምሯቸው የተለያየ ሐሳብ ይዘው ግን አንድ አይነት ሐሳብ ያላቸው መስሏቸው ገብተውበት ከዛ በኋላ ችግር ውስጥ ከሚገቡ በዚህ መልኩ ሐሳቦቻቸውን ተወያይተው ዲቴል አድርገው ይዘው then ጽፈውት እሱ ላይ ክርክርም ድርድርም ካስፈለገ ጭቅጭቅም ተደርጎ ውይይት ተደርጎ ስምምነት ተደርጎ አንድ አይነት ወጥ የሆነ ሐሳብ ይዘን እንድንሄድ የምንጠቀምበት ፕሮሰስ ነው ማለት ይቻላል። ኢኒሺዬሽን ብለን እንለዋለን። then የፕላኒንግ ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕ ያው ከወሰንን በኋላ የፕሮጀክቱን ተግባር ዋናውን ዓላማ ፕሮጀክቱ የሚሄድበትን አቅጣጫ ካስያዝነው በኋላ ባለሙያዎችን ይዘን እቅድ እናወጣለን። ሶ የእቅድ ስራዎች በሙሉ in the planning process group ይሰራሉ ማለት ነው። ሶስተኛው executing process group ብለን ያልነው የታቀደውን ነገር መተግበር ነው። ያንን ነገር ወደ ትግበራ ማምጣት፣ ከሐሳብ ወደ እውን የመለወጥ ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕ ነው executing። monitoring and controlling ያቀድነውን ነገር እየሰራን ነው ወይ፣ ወደዛ አቅጣጫ እየሄድን ነው ወይ የሚለውን ቼክ የምናደርግበት የምንፈትሽበትና ችግርም ካለ አስተካክለን የምንሄድበት፣ የተበላሸ ነገር ባይኖርም እንኳን አቅጣጫ እየለቀቀ ሲሄድ ያስታውቃል አይደል? therefore እነዛን ነገሮች የምናስተካክልበት እና የምንቆጣጠርበት፣ የምናውቅበት፣ የምንለካበት፣ የምናስተውልበት ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕ ነው። ክሎዚንግ ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕ as the name suggests ያው ፕሮጀክቱን በጥሩ ሁኔታ ኮንክሉድ ለማድረግ ለመዝጋት የምንጠቀምበት ኤሪያ ነው the closing process group ብለን የምንጠራው። ስለዚህ ኖርማሊ ፕሮጀክቶች ሲጀመሩ የሚሰጣቸውን አይነት አጽንኦት ላያገኙ ይችላሉ ክሎዚንግ ላይ በተለያየ ምክንያት። ሶ አስፈላጊው በሆነ መልኩ ኮንክሉድ እንዲደረግ ፕሮጀክቱ ዶኪመንቴሽን እንዲሰራ፣ ስራዎች ማስረከብ እንዲቻሉ፣ ተረካቢውም ጤናማ በሆነ መልኩ ተረክቦ እንዲወስድ፣ ከዚህ በፊት የሄድንበት ፕሮጀክቱን ስንተገብር ስንመራ የሄድንበትን መንገድ ገምግመን እሱን ዶኪመንት አድርገን ከትበን እንድንይዝ፣ ለሚቀጥለው ፕሮጀክታችን ደግሞ ትምህርት እንዲሆነን መረጃዎች እንድንይዝና እውቀታችንን ማደራጅተን አለ ጤናማ በሆነ መልኩ ፕሮጀክትን ኮንክሉድ ለማድረግ ለመዝጋት የምንጠቀምበት ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕ ነው ማለት ነው። ሶ የዛሬው ፖድካስት ላይ ፎከስ የማድርገው ኢኒሺዬቲንግ ፕሮሰስ ግሩፕ ነው ማለት ነው። how to initiate an idea from idea to reality ስንሄድ የምንሄድበት ነው። ሶ የሚመከረው ኖርማሊ ፒኤምአይዝም እያልን እንጠራዋለን። ፒኤምአይዝም እንደ ፒኤምአይ ፕሮጀክት ማኔጅመንት ኢንስቲትዩት ማሰብ ማለት ነው፣ ወይንም ለፕሮጀክት በሚጠቅም መልኩ ማሰብ ማለት ነው። ሶ an idea should have an owner ባለቤት የሌለው ሐሳብ የሚተገብረው የሚያስተካክለው የለም ብዙ ጊዜና ይህንን ሐሳብ ከሐሳብነት ተነስቶ የሐሳብ ውይይት፣ የሐሳብ ክርክር፣ የሐሳብ መደራደር፣ የሐሳብ መጣል፣ የሐሳብ ማሻሻል፣ የሐሳብ መውሰድ እና እነዚህን ሁሉ ደግሞ የሐሳብ መጽሐፍ መከተብ፣ ዶኪመንት ማድረግ ስራዎችን የሚሰራ ሰው ቢኖረው ጥሩ ነው። So select a project manager just when it was an idea ይላሉ። So I have a project manager just when you have this idea, and that's the first thing recommended ማለት ነው። Then the other thing እዚህ ጋር ያለን ምንድን ነው? When you are selected as a project manager, you're not expected to work directly ወይንም ደግሞ ቀጥታ እንዲህ መሆን አለበት ብለን መምከር አያስፈልገንም ማለት ነው። We want to do here is determine the company culture, the enterprise environmental factors, understand the business case and existing system units, systems, what are they የሚለውን ነው የምናየው ማለት ነው። So we have to determine all this. So as a good project manager ቀድመን የምንገባበት ፕሮጀክት ያለበትን ከባቢ ሁኔታ እናስተውላለን። የድርጅቱን ባህል እናስተውላለን። የድርጅቱ ውስጥ ያሉ ሰዎች ያላቸውን መስተጋብር እንዳለ አስተሳሰባቸውን፣ እነዚህን ነገሮች ሁሉ አስተውለን መጀመር አለብን ማለት ነው። ሶ ኤንተርፕራይዝ ኢንቫይሮንመንታል ፋክተር ወይም ፕሮጀክቱ ያለበት ከባቢ ሁኔታ ወይም ፒምቦክስ ተፈለይ እንደውም they call it business environment። ስለዚህ እሱን አስተውለን አይተን እንሄዳለን ማለት ነው። the other thing is እንግዲህ መረዳት ነው። before you prescribe you should diagnose የሚል ነገር የሆነ ቦታ አንብቤ ነበር እና ልክ ዶክተሮች ምናምን ቀጥታ መድኃኒት ከማዘዛቸው በፊት ይመረምራሉ። ከመረመሩ በኋላ ችግሩን ከተረዱ ሩት ኮዙን ከተረዱ በኋላ ነው ይህንን አይነት መድኃኒት ብትወስዱ እንዲህ አይነት ለውጥ ብታደርጉ ችግር ይፈታል ይስተካከላል ብለው የሚሉት ማለት ነው። just like that you as the project manager also ቀድመን ማወቅ ያለብን ነገር ካምፓኒ ካልቸር፣ ኤግዚስቲንግ ሲስተምስ፣ ኤንተርፕራይዝ ኢንቫይሮንመንታል ፋክተር፣ ቢዝነስ ኢንቫይሮንመንትን መረዳት ነው። አንዱ ከባቢ ሁኔታ ብለን በቀላሉ ልንጠራው እንችላለን እንዲያስረዳን ያህል። ሌላኛው ደግሞ ድርጅት ውስጥ ያሉትን የስራ ሂደቶች፣ መመሪያዎች፣ ዳይሬክቲቮች፣ ስታንዳርድ ኦፕሬቲንግ ፕሮሲጀሮች እነዚህን ሁሉ እና ሂስቶሪካል ኢንፎርሜሽን ሪሌትድ ቱ ዲስ ፕሮጀክት ወይንም ደግሞ ሲሚላር ፕሮጀክት ያሉትን ሁሉ ምናይበት ይሆናል። ሶ አውቀን የምንገባበትን ነገር እንድንሄድ ነው። ጋፕ አናሊሲስ እንድንሰራ ነው። ሁሉም ፕሮጀክቶች የተሟላ OPA የላቸውም፣ ኦርጋናይዜሽናል ፕሮሰስ አሴትስ። ስለዚህ ምን የሚጎለው አለ የሚለውንም ማወቅ እንድንችል ይረዳናል ማለት ነው። Then as a very good project manager, you should divide your project into phases or smaller projects. This is also very important. ያልሰለጠነ ወይንም ልምድ የሌለው project manager ብዙ ጊዜ is trying to manage the project in one go, and that's not good because you really can't foresee or forecast everything that's going to happen on your project. The best way to do is to divide the big project into different groups or phases. ስለዚህ አሁን ከፋፍለን ስንይዛቸው ለመረዳት እንችላለን ማለት ነው, which is very much easier for us to manage the project. ስለዚህ divide large project into phases or smaller groups. Then based on that, you may decide, when we move to the planning process group, you may decide what planning approach you're going to use, adaptive or predictive, or would you like to go for a hybrid, a combination of them የሚለውን መወሰን ይቻላል ማለት ነው። ሶ ይህንን ከፋፍለን እንያዘው። ፕሮጀክቱን ከፋፍለን ካልያዝ ነው ብዙ ጊዜ ትልቅ ችግር ውስጥ ያስገባናል፣ ሙሉ ዲቴይሉን ማወቅ ስለማንችል ማለት ነው። Also, you really have to understand the business case. Why did they get into the project on the first place? ይሄ ድርጅት እዚህ ፕሮጀክት ውስጥ ለምን ገባ? What are they trying to achieve here? So let's try to understand the business case. ምን ችግር ለመፍታት ነው ይህን ፕሮጀክት ያቋቋሙት? ወይንም ምን ኦፖርቹኒቲ መልካም አጋጣሚ አጋጥሟቸው እሱን ለማግኘት ሲሉ የጀመሩት? So what are these business cases? The other thing is the benefits management plan. So the benefit management plan, there are people who benefit from this project. there are divisions or departments or institutions or communities that benefit from this project. Therefore, benefits management plan አዘጋጅተን እነዛን ስቴክሆልደሮቻችንን ለይተን ምን አይነት ቤኔፊት ለማግኘት እንደምንሞክር ወይም እንደሚሞክሩ ዘርዝረን ይዘን ብንጀምር, you will be much better project manager. So you have to understand the business case and the benefits management plan. You also have to uncover initial requirements, assumptions, risks, constraints, and existing agreements. So what are we trying to say here? Uncover initial requirements. እንግዲህ ቀድሞ የተሰጠንን requiremenቶች ዘርዝረን ማወቅ መቻል ማለት ነው. You know, your project sponsor may not be that sophisticated enough to tell you the exact requirement. Therefore, you have to ask, you have to inquire, you have to dig in to find the root cause of the project. Now, what requirements really should this project fulfill የሚለውን አውቆ መጀመር ያስፈልጋል. And we all make assumptions. Projects begin with assumptions. በግምት ብለን ብንለው ኤግዛክት ትርጉሙ ላይሆን ይችላል። assumption የሆነ የገመት ነው ይህን ፕሮጀክት በገባንበት ጊዜ ያሟላልናል ብለን ያሰብነው ነገር አለ። እሱ ነገር ምንድን ነው? So assumption has to be collected. Assumption is a thing that is accepted as true or certain to happen. But the case, it's without proof. The action of taking on power or responsibility. ብለውም ይተረጉሙታል assumption-ን። ግን ዋናው ነገር ይሄ ነገር ይሆናል ብለን የምንገምተው ነገር assumption ተብሎ ይጠራል ማለት ነው። ግን ይህንን assumption በሆነ መለኪያ ተለክቶ really true assumption ነው አይደለም የሚለውን ግን ለማወቅ አዳጋጅ ነው አንዳንዴ። Unfortunately, projects ደግሞ የሚጀመሩት assumption-ን መሰረት አድርገው ነው። Therefore, you have to uncover these assumptions. And people won't tell you their assumptions clearly. So, እነዛን assumptions አውቀን ብንጀምር መልካም ነገር ነው ማለት ነው። እስቲ let me check. Assumption. ያው ግምት ብሎ ነው ኢቭን የተረጎመው። ያው መገመት አይነት ነገር ነው። ግን አንድ ግለሰብ ሲገምትና ድርጅት ሲገምት የተለያየ ነው። So when a group of people make this assumption, ፕሮጀክቱ በዛ መልኩ ይሄዳል ማለት ነው። So ይሄ assumption ግን እንደዛ እንደሚያስቡ እንደዛ እንደሚገምቱ ካልጠየቃችሁ፣ ካልነገሯችሁ፣ ካልተጻፈ የሚገኝበት ቦታ የለም። So you have to collect this. You have to also ask and find the risks. You also have to make some checks on risks from your side, any constraints and any existing agreements. ድርጅታችን የፈረመው ማንኛውንም አይነት ውሎች አንብበን ተረድተን ይህን ነገር ወደ ኢኒሺዬቲንግ ለፕሮጀክት ቻርተር ግብአት እንዲሆን ማስገባት አለብን። So what we are trying to achieve here in the initiating process group is that of developing a project charter. Most projects begin without a charter. Yes, they have a project proposal and sometimes they have a memorandum of understanding. Most of the time they also have contracts. But the best thing for a project is to have a project charter derived from all the above documents. ስለዚህ ለዛ ሂደት ነው እየሄድን ያለን ነው። You first determine the enterprise environmental factor. You just observe and learn, and then you collect processes, procedures, historical information. You learn how the company operates. Then you divide large projects into smaller groups or phases, and you're trying to understand the business case. Why did they get into the project on the first place? You're trying to understand who are the beneficiaries of this project. You're going to list them down. You're going to uncover the initial requirements. You're going to uncover the assumptions, the constraints. You're going to list down the risks as you know it today, and you're going to go through any contracts that were signed to understand. And now you have to make a decision for yourself. You have to assess the project and the product feasibility with all the given constraints. Is this feasible? Could this be done? የሚለውን ማወቅ ያስፈልጋል. How are we going to make sure that this is going to be becoming a reality. So the first person that needs to be convinced is you. ስለዚህ are you convinced enough that this is a feasible project? Are you convinced enough that this is a feasible product? Do you think you can handle everything that comes along on the project with the given constraints? የሚለውን ማወቅ ያስፈልጋል. So with that you have to create measurable objectives. You have to list down success criteria or measurable project objectives and take it to your project sponsor and ask, would you consider me successful if I fulfill this? Is this what you have in mind? Is this your definition of success? የሚለውን አውቀን መሄድ አለብን. With all that, after you get yes, this is what I have in mind, ካሉ perfect. If they say no, that's not what I have in mind, kalum, it is perfect. Why do I say that? Because gana ወረቀት ላይ ነው ሐሳቡ ያለው, ትግበራ ላይ አልገባችሁም. Have you done a lot of work, spent a lot of resources on that project, and had they say this is not what I have in mind, እሱ ችግር ነው. That's a loss. ስለዚህ አሁን በሐሳብ ስለሆነ ያለው it's all right, you can correct it. With that, you develop a project charter. What's a project charter? It's a document which charts the way forward. አቅጣጫ ጠቋሚ ነው። ፕሮጀክቱ ላይ መስራት የምንፈልገውን ነገሮች በሙሉ ጥሩ አድርጎ ዶኪመንት አድርጎ ይዞልናል. So then you have to develop this charter, you have to take it to your project sponsor, you have to get it signed, and the charter gives you the power and the authority to commit organizational resources to the project. The charter also defines the type of authority that you have on your project. The charter also documents all assumptions, risk, constraints, requirements, stakeholders as known to date. The charter also defines, so to speak, the broad scope and the time that it's going to take. And the charter also defines how much the company is ready to commit resources, financial or otherwise. So it's really an important document. The project charter is your starting point. You are appointed to run the project by a charter. During the closing process group, you will be handing over the project by the charter. So do not start a project without a project charter. You need to also identify stakeholders. You have to identify all of them. You have to list all your stakeholders in your stakeholder register. You have to determine their expectation and know it. But with all that, it will be much easier for you to manage their interest, influence, and impact. So then you are on a very good ground to start your project. But if you feel that some things are not documented or are not approved, which are required by the project, you could trigger a change request, because now you have a signed charter. Before the project was signed, you're free to make some changes on the draft version. But now, after the project charter is signed, you have to go through a formal change management process, and that needs to be, documented. And we said assumptions are important, and we make assumptions at the start of the project. So based on that, we're going to make planning. All planning efforts take assumption as one of their inputs. Most executing areas also base their execution based on assumption, because people are going to refer to the plan. But the monitoring and controlling process group also relies on assumption. So let's define your assumptions in an assumptions log. The assumptions log is a log where you list down all the assumptions that you make and list down all the constraints that you face on this project. So the assumptions log has both of them. You also need to develop a stakeholder register. All the project stakeholders has to be registered so that you have a strategy to manage the negatively impacted stakeholders as well as the positively impacted stakeholders by your project. And know that your stakeholders also could impact you in a negative or positive way. Therefore, if you list them down, you can protect yourself from negative influences. You can support yourself in getting all positive impacts and influences. So this is it, guys. The initiating process group is the starting point in the 5 process groups, and this is where we capture an idea, document it, and then move on. So thank you for listening to me. Next we'll be moving on to the planning process group. So we're back. Project Management Podcast. Nebiyu Balalahuin. This time around, we'll be looking at the planning process group. I'm talking about a predictive project management approach, and it has 5 process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. And now let's start with planning, the planning process group. During the initiating process group, you are alone most of the time, or a few people with you. During the planning process group, though, you should not be alone. You should be doing planning with subject matter experts. These subject matter experts are the ones who knows the details of the project. So the planning work is a group activity. It is not a one-person show. So at the start, you have to determine what development approach you're going to use for your project. Are you going to have a predictive, adaptive, or hybrid? You also have to define the life cycle that you will use for your project. So the life cycle tells you the detailed steps that you're going to use on your project. So this life cycle could be dictated by your project sponsor, or this life cycle could be an industry standard. This life cycle could be a quality management system standard, or this life cycle could be one which you define tailored for this project. And you need to decide the type of plans that are needed for your project. So you have to define and prioritize your requirements. You get these requirements from the charter. You have to define and create the project scope statement. We move on. I think I stop here for today. We should cut this section about planning. ስለዚህ initiating ላይ ብቻ focus እናድርግ. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great one. I'll be seeing you soon.